if you can grab the front lights on the way. So I mentioned this to folks. Can anybody gonna fall asleep light-wise? We good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Can you still see okay back there? Yeah. Awesome. So this topic, as I mentioned to folks who were here a little early, super broad. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a general overview of a bunch of the different areas of where things are as we go. If there's an area that I mentioned and you're like, I would really like to know more about that, jot it down. At the end, I'm going to try to reserve some time so then the specific areas that you folks are most interested in are the ones we can go into more depth on. But we can't do depth on everything because the military is freaking everywhere and does lots of stuff, so that's kind of where we're at. The other thing is the lectures that I do usually run about an hour and a half. I think the program technically says an hour, but I've always done an hour and a half because that's what I'm used to and they never stop me. This time we may end up needing to go a little longer than that. You are welcome to stay for that time. If you would like to, you're also welcome to take off and no one will glare at you or give you the stink eye if you do. So that's kind of where we're at. If you have questions as we go, throw them my way. For a number of them, I may say, hang on to that. We'll get to that later. And if I forget to get to it later, poke me. So I do. Sound good? And if anybody has trouble hearing me, let me know. I don't usually use a microphone for projection in a room like this, but if it's necessary, absolutely ask, and I'm happy to help. So let's talk about the world, the military, and everything that's involved there. First off, here's a basic idea of where US troops and where US presence around the world is. If you can see, there are a couple places where we're super concentrated. Japan, actually, technically, we're in Okinawa, actually, which is down there. But Japan, Germany are both places where we have a ton of troops, as well as Italy over here in Afghanistan. You kind of see the setup. Ranges here give you an approximate idea. Right now, we have 170,000 troops actively deployed around the world. Our standing army, or our total military force, is around 1 million. So most of those folks are back at home, or they're logistics folks. I believe that number also includes National Guard. So got a lot more people than we have deployed, but we still have a lot of folks deployed. In the 30 to 40,000 range, you're looking mainly Germany, Japan, Afghanistan as your main areas. You'll note Iraq. This is, I think, a year or two old, so the numbers in and around Iraq may have gone down. But this is a general idea of where we're positioned. Second, this is how I'd like to organize the discussion today. There are a bunch of different what are called joint commands in the US military. It's a structure that's evolved over time, but in the last few decades, it's solidified pretty well. The entire world is divided into 6 different command groups. You've got NORTHCOM, or NORTHCOM rather, which is the US and Mexico, Canada. We'll talk about that. SOUTHCOM down here, South America and Central America and the Caribbean as well. AFRICOM, which is all the stuff in and around Africa with the exception of Egypt, which is the Middle East and to some extent Northeastern Europe, or actually Southeastern rather. European Command, or EUCOM, which will be all of up here. And then Indo-PACCOM, which used to be PACCOM until this year when they changed the name to Indo-PACCOM. Partially because it's not just the Pacific, it's also India, and India's second largest country in the world, and actually largest, well, depends. Big country, big issues, we wanted to include it. So what we'll do is we'll look at those different areas, then we're also going to look at these 4 functional commands, which means these are other things, other major divisions of command in the military that are not based on geography, but based on task and based on focus. So Spec Ops, or SOCOM, which involves special operations units that go all over the globe. So they work and liaise with each of the different regional commands, but they are their own not branch, because branch of the military are a different thing, but their own joint command. Transcom actually gets almost no attention, but is super important. They are the folks who make sure that the military gets, like, food to eat and gas to drive tanks and things. Any logistical type stuff, they're the ones who do the oversight for. They're not tremendously controversial, so we're not going to spend a bunch of time on them, but they are a command that gets overlooked sometimes, and you can never win a war without logistics, and these folks are the backbone of that. So I just want to give them their due. Stratcom these are the folks with the nukes. So the Stratcom is where all of our ICBMs, those are controlled by these folks. They have a degree of control over nuclear launch subs, all that kind of stuff. And then finally, Cybercom is the newest of the commands that's been added. It's only since Obama's time that Cybercom started to get up and running. It's still in the process of building, but it does defense against cyber attacks and potentially cyber offense, though the degree to which it can do that is still somewhere between classified and unspecified. So a lot of that is kind of up in the air. Everybody with me on the general divisions that we're going to go ahead and look through? All right. So let's start off with NORTHCOM. NORTHCOM is responsible for defending the US mainland and Alaska. Not Hawaii. Hawaii falls under PACCOM or Indo-PACCOM. But they defend US mainland and Alaska in case of any kind of military attack. You may have noticed, but it's been a while since anybody attacked the US mainland. As such, NORTHCOM doesn't do a ton in terms of active combatant fighting compared to some of the other commands that we're going to talk about. However, they are highly involved in disaster relief. Most recently, the BP oil spill, if you remember, in the Gulf of Mexico. Gulf of Mexico is part of NORTHCOM's territory. They were some of the ones who were on site helping to transport things around, helping to deal with that issue. So they are actively involved, and they're the ones that the National Guard will often coordinate with if the National Guard is mobilized outside of a purely state-level endeavor. But that's NORTHCOM. The other thing that NORTHCOM does that's really important is they're the central point of intelligence cooperation with the FBI, the CIA, the DIA, all kinds of organizations like that. So any organization that deals with intelligence, they can work with and do work with and brief all the different commands, but NORTHCOM is the primary place where most of that information gets centralized and gets distributed. So while they aren't on the active front lines in terms of fighting all that often, they do a lot of important stuff behind the scenes, and a lot of stuff that we don't often think of, but is worth knowing and being aware of. We're going to shift to SOUTHCOM. Like I said, we're going to go through these kind of quick to start with, and then we'll hone in based on where people are interested. SOUTHCOM, Central and South America and the Caribbean. A couple things. SOUTHCOM is one that also doesn't get as much attention. During the Cold War, it was much more active because they were involved in some of the proxy wars indirectly that happened in Latin America. There are a few things that are specifically worth knowing. First, responsible for South and Central America as well as the Caribbean, but they also cooperate with a bunch of regional actors and a bunch of different nations in the Caribbean for disaster relief. When Haiti had problems both with hurricanes and earthquakes, SOUTHCOM is the division, the part of the US military that comes in to help them out with those things. So they do have a fair amount of experience in that area. In addition, and this is probably the most controversial thing, at least recently, about SOUTHCOM, is something called the School of the Americas. Anybody familiar with that? Or anybody heard about it? It hasn't been in the news for a few decades now, and there's a reason for that. It was highly controversial. It is basically, or was, well, kind of is still, we'll talk about that in a sec. It was something that the military set up and said, all right, we want to train people from other militaries in Latin America and Central America. So if you want to come here, we will train you on how to do soldier, military stuff better. We will train you sometimes on other stuff too. But the idea is we would make military forces from Latin American countries more effective by having folks come, train with us, and then go home. Sounds like a decent idea. Problem is, some of what we taught was not always ideal. There are a number of graduates of the School of the Americas that went on to lead death squads, went on to engage in massive human rights abuses, torture of local civilian populations, help overthrow governments, all kinds of problems. There's debate about to what degree the School of the Americas is responsible for that, but there is enough correlation between people who came there and then went and did bad stuff, and there's enough evidence of training manuals and stuff in Spanish that we used that showed how to use things that are basically torture techniques that people got kind of skeptical of it. That led to Congress saying, okay, enough of this. Cold War's done. Like, that was sketchy back then. It's super sketchy now. Stop it. 2000, Congress says, no more School of the Americas. Shut it down. Not okay. So they shut it down. And then the next year they reopened it with a different name. So it is now the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, or WSEC, I think is technically the acronym. And it exists in almost exactly the same form. One of the people that was interviewed shortly after it reopened was someone who had run the School of the Americas and said, yeah, one of the generals there, they rehired almost all of the same people. They are using the same training manuals. They are doing the same thing. They have just changed the name. The people who run it claim that they have included human rights training along with other things, and that makes it cool. And they say that they've changed some of the programs. Folks who have tried to keep an eye on this are fairly skeptical of that, of those claims. But because a lot of it is somewhat like, this sort of straddles the divide between public and overt military action and covert action, which would usually be more CIA type stuff. This is kind of somewhere in the fuzzy area in between. So this isn't something that we can talk about in a lot more detail if you'd like. This is one of those points that I was saying, pick out if you'd like. But this is probably one of the more controversial or at least unusual things when it comes to SOUTHCOM and what they've been doing recently and in the recent past. Questions on SOUTHCOM? Yeah?
Did American military engage in any of this?
What we would do is we would train people here, and then those people we trained from somewhere else. So like if you are a Bolivian colonel, we will bring you into the school, invite you to come to the School of the Americas. We will teach you a bunch of stuff. What we teach you is not exactly public knowledge. And then we will send you back to Bolivia, and then you lead a death squad. And we're like, we don't know anything about that. We had no idea you would do that. It happens the death squad you're leading is killing off people who are opposed to this faction of the government, which we don't like anyway, so kudos. But yeah, it's arguably, again, this is, I don't want to come out too strongly in either direction because the evidence is fairly strong that a lot of what they did is not okay, but there are folks who will argue it is a necessary component to being able to engage in non-conventional warfare. But there, I think, is a fairly strong argument that this is a way of waging proxy wars in Latin America without being as directly involved as we were some of the time during the Cold War. So we're not supplying arms or anything like that. We're not putting any of our troops on the ground there, but we are bringing their people, training them to make them better, and choosing who we train in a way that will support causes we agree with. Does that speak to your question? Cool. Yeah?
Just for my own
clarification,
because I'm so naive about all this, when you say NORTHCOM and SOUTHCOM,
Yeah.
the individuals in those regions, do they include all branches of the military?
Great question. I should have clarified this. This is actually a really good question. No, very nice. You're good. For all of these, so the way it works, you have your branches of the military, right? Anyone name all four of them? Navy? Marines is not technically. The Coast Guard is the fourth branch, which everybody forgets. The Marines is technically a division of the Navy. They're the amphibious assault portion of the Navy, at least initially. Now they've very much become their own thing. But historically, that was the setup that everybody misses. But yeah, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Coast Guard. And then the Marines are pretty much there, but not technically. So for all of those branches, these are NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, et cetera, are referred to as joint commands. So it's where if I'm in charge of SOUTHCOM, right, I am an admiral or a general who has the ability to access all military assets in that area or that are responsible for that area. That means any of the four branches, I can pull people from any of those. And one of the reasons we created this, and there's some really good explanation behind it, is we wanted our forces to be able to cooperate more effectively. Because if the Navy does its own thing and the Army does its own thing, then not only do we not work together as well, we can end up bombing some place that the Army was planning to occupy or something along those lines. So this means that we have a joint commander or a commander who's in charge of the whole area who can put all those pieces together and say, all right, this area I need operational security, I need communications, so I'm going to send some Air Force airstrike callers in there, but I also need ground-based protection, so I'm going to send this division of the Army in there to do that, etc. Does that answer your question?
And all of those people,
Come on in.
are in those areas already?
Yes,
Residing
generally, but not necessarily. They're available to be deployed to those areas, which may mean that they're in a base in the US, but that they are an asset that is available to be utilized in that area, even if they aren't actively in the theater there. Yeah, excellent question, thank you. And something I kind of skipped past. Go ahead.
That issue going on in where that reporter was killed in Turkey.
Yep.
Saudi Arabia is alleged to have killed it. Were they trained? These people who are alleged to have done it.
Yeah.
Was there some similar training in Saudi Arabia?
Not in terms of the military, as far as I know. The CIA very well may have worked with groups like that. We would generally not be aware if that were the case. The last really super high-profile group the CIA trained were the Mujahideen, who became Al-Qaeda and hit us on 9/11, so their track record isn't ideal. But yeah, as far as I know, the US military wasn't involved in any of the training of those individuals. Part of it is, back in the day, we may have been more involved there, but now Saudi Arabia has enough of that internal infrastructure they can do that themselves. They're pretty good at abusing and torturing people if they want to, sadly. Yeah?
Do we have non-designated troops that get allocated as needed to regional command?
To some degree, the National Guard will work that way, and then if we activate a National Guard unit, we can activate them and then assign them to any given command that needs them. It's also possible to shift troops from one command to another as they're required. But by default, everyone generally falls into one of these areas because someone's got to be the person they report to at the top of the chain. Great questions. Let's keep going. So, next where we're going is CENTCOM. This one is in depth. This is where our current, so General Mattis, now he's a civilian, the Secretary of Defense, he was the former commander of CENTCOM before he retired and then became Secretary of Defense. CENTCOM is basically the Middle East. So this is one of the most active regions in the world, and it's one of the most active combat regions in the world. We're going to spend probably the most time on CENTCOM and INDOPACOM because those are the two that see the most action and have the most deployment. I'm going to jump back to a map periodically as we talk through things here. I was trying to come up with a good way to intersperse it into the slides, and there really isn't, sadly. So we'll jump back as needed. But CENTCOM includes Afghanistan, which keeps you pretty freaking busy. Afghanistan is, in fact, the longest war in U.S. history, now running at, I believe, 17 and a half years. So, you know, it's been a while. It is also traditionally referred to as the graveyard of empires for a very good reason. The Russians, the British, us, lots of people have tried to conquer it and control it and never really had a ton of luck. There are a lot of reasons for that, and I'm happy to go into those in more detail if people would like. The other thing to note about Afghanistan is, especially given our current policy, it is very likely to remain a stalemate for the foreseeable future. And again, we can go into more detail there, but based on the current strategy and troop allocations that we have, it is very unlikely that the Taliban and groups that support them and other terrorist groups there will be effectively pushed out of Afghanistan. They will probably still retain a fair amount of control in a lot of the tribal and rural areas, whereas the central portion of Afghanistan, the capital of Kabul, will generally retain a decent amount of security and control, but it's probably going to stay an active war zone in perpetuity, or at least until the U.S. decides to leave. Next major area in CENTCOM's responsibility to mention is Syria. Syrian civil war is actually in the process of not as much winding down as concluding brutally. Right now, the U.S., our involvement in Syria is largely based on air power. We've launched some missile strikes there. We do air support for some of the troops that are on the ground there. This is another thing that I can go into a ton of detail on if you'd like, but that's honestly a whole extra presentation in and of itself. But short version is we're doing air power and we're providing some logistics and some training support. So we do have some troops on the ground there, but they are not intended to be frontline troops who are going off and taking positions. They're intended to be troops who train some of the groups that we like and work with, the Kurds being, or the Kurdish militia called the Peshmerga is one of the groups that they work with a ton, which is one reason Turkey is super pissed at us, but that's a whole nother thing. So Syria, our involvement exists, but it is largely air power based. It is not front lines based the way that it is in Afghanistan. Syria is also functionally a proxy war, and this is something that's really worth understanding. I'll do the bare basics on it, and again, we can do depth later. Two sides. Got one side, well, more than two, but for simplicity's sake, two-ish sides. On one side, you have the US, the Kurds, which is an ethnic group of people who live there that don't have their own country. The Saudis indirectly, and various Syrian rebel groups. Some of the rebel groups are jihadist groups, and we officially don't like them, but we do like some of the other groups that are more like democracy for everybody, and mostly me. So that's kind of one side. The other side, President Assad, who is the leader of Syria and the Syrian government, as well as Russia and Iran. Russia is tremendously active in Syria. The US has largely backed out under President Trump. We've committed a lot less engagement there recently as Russia has stepped up its engagement, and that's a lot of why the Syrian civil war is probably going to end in the next year or so, probably sooner, with the regime, Assad's regime, crushing the remainder of the rebels and retaking control of most of the country. The big question will be whether they push to annihilate the Kurds as well or not, and that's going to be interesting. But those are basically the two sides. Iran has arranged to fund and support the Assad regime and some of the groups that work with it. There are not a ton of Iranians on the ground there. There are more now than there were earlier, but those are sort of the groups that are involved on both sides. Part of what makes it so dicey is the US really wants to avoid bombing Russian troops, because that's how you start World War III. And the Russians really want to avoid bombing US troops, because that also potentially starts World War III, both of which are bad. You also have Turkey indirectly involved. They kind of don't like anybody involved in this setup. They really don't like the Kurds, though, so they're supporting whoever will let them come and bomb the Kurds most, which gets messy. So that's Syria, which is a nightmare scenario in a lot of ways. U.S. involved, but only to a somewhat limited degree. Very little exposure of danger to our people on the ground. And the strategy was largely designed to minimize danger to our people, not to maximize the effect of what we want, if that makes sense. It's a strategy designed to minimize losses, not to maximize gains. Because politically, body bags coming back to Dover are a really bad thing. And that was true under Obama as well. Iran, oh boy, whole nother day's worth of stuff. But short versions here. There are some naval issues with Iran that are particularly important where, so US Navy, pretty awesome, far and away the best in the world. We have the most significant aircraft carrier power. We have the most significant ability to move large numbers of troops or people or assets to anywhere we need them to really quickly, really efficiently. Our submarine capacity is generally good, though there are some countries that are coming close to parity with us. They're still a ways away. What Iran has done, and what a number of other countries have done, when we get to Indo-PACOM, we'll talk about China's naval strategy, which is actually very interesting. Most nations have not attempted to challenge the US and go toe-to-toe with us. They've instead decided to create ways to exploit our weaknesses. So one of the things that Iran has done is they've developed a set of swift boat, or basically little speedboat type things that they use as one of their main naval forces. They can't do what our Navy can do, which is launch missiles, and we don't actually use battleships are pretty much obsolete these days. Missile cruisers are more of what we use. But we can park a ship off of a coastline and obliterate an area with cruise missiles. That's a lot of what we can do. With torpedoes and whatnot, we can do similar stuff to any other large naval craft. What we're not great at is hitting very small, quick-moving craft, and that's what Iran has developed. Those things can't bombard a coastline like we can, and they can't slug it out with giant aircraft carriers or anything. But what they can do is potentially get close enough to a ship to either drop mines or depth charges, well, wouldn't be depth charges, they'd be mines, or attach explosives to those ships, or fire other small ordnance that can cause problems, or, and again, probably not destroy our ships, but definitely cripple them, kill some people on board, and make it so they can't easily relocate to wherever else they want to go. And that's one of the problems that we're having now is there are games of chicken basically being played from time to time with the Iranian swift boats and US full-on cruisers and destroyers. We don't know how that's going to resolve. At this point, Iran has not actually engaged, they haven't opened fire on any of our ships. They haven't planted any bombs or mines as they sweep by. But they theoretically could. And if you're standing on the bridge of a ship and there's something that comes by you that could blow up part of your ship and you can't open fire on it, that's a tremendously stressful position to be in. And potentially at some point, someone's going to break and fire first, and that becomes a big problem. And so a lot of what's happening right now, Iran is betting the US won't do that and is hoping that by doing enough of this, it can show the region that it can wave at the US and it can taunt them, and the US can't stop them, which will elevate their status in the region and have them seen as more important.
Was the Cole an incident like that?
The Cole was different. Bombing of the USS Cole, Iran tangentially involved. They supported a group that supported another group that was involved there. They didn't directly do it. But the bombing of the USS Cole was a different deal. That was people who basically rowed a small boat up to a docked ship, put stuff on it, boom. They're trying to do this on the open seas as opposed to when a ship is docked, which is a lot harder to do, and it's why it's taken them longer to set it up. But it's that kind of an attack, not launching from another ship that can go toe-to-toe, but asymmetrical warfare, where a small number of people with a small number of weapons can try to take out a much bigger thing. It's the same thing in a lot of ways that happened to the US in Vietnam. If you ever saw the pictures or were there where they were trying to lift tanks up out of the mud or lift armored vehicles up and carry them places, whereas the Viet Cong could move very, very freely because they were smaller, lighter troops that didn't have heavy armor. They utilized an entirely different approach. They didn't try to fight us in the same way, they fought us in a different way. It's what we did to the British in the Revolutionary War, right? We didn't have massive numbers of cannons or massive regiments of troops. We were almost always outnumbered. Guerrilla warfare was the way that we won. This is basically guerrilla warfare on the sea level, and them showing that they can do it. So that's a lot of what's happening there. There's also someplace called the Strait of Hormuz. I'm going to jump back to the map here to show you what I'm talking about. Zoop. Bink. This little chunk of territory right here is one of the 2 or 3 most important places in the world. And the reason is pretty much all of the oil that comes from the Persian Gulf flows directly through there. And at its narrow point, it's only a mile or 2 across. Actually, it's a little larger than that, but not by much. So if, in theory, Iran can block off the Strait of Hormuz, or at least make it so ships can't easily get past there, I mean, it's technically part of their territory on this end, they can basically shut down or significantly dampen the entire world's economy. And the US, at the top of that, would suffer significantly. So one of the biggest concerns of CENTCOM is that either some sort of terrorist group sets off a dirty bomb or something here if they get a hold of it. Like if a terrorist group really wants to mess with the US, setting off a dirty bomb is not an actual nuclear bomb, but it's a bomb with some low-yield radioactive material around it so that you don't get a nuclear explosion, but you get an explosion and then a bunch of radiation in the area, which means you can't really sail through it or move through it very easily because radiation is bad. Ask the people at Chernobyl, right? So it's much easier to build than an actual nuclear weapon. That's the real scenario that most defense planners are worried about in terms of nuclear terrorism, is not a fully functional nuclear weapon unless it's stolen from Russia or someplace, but a dirty bomb, which is not full-on nuclear, but can cause a lot of damage and a lot of panic. But setting off something like that in the Strait of Hormuz would cripple the world economy, and that's something we're understandably nervous about. Iran could decide that they're going to say, we're not going to allow any passage of ships through the Strait of Hormuz without paying a 10% tax, at which point the US would go to war against Iran.
Did they actually have jurisdiction over that whole area?
Half of it. Based on where the setup is here, so it'd be the other half, would be on one of the Gulf Emirates, but UAE actually technically, United Arab Emirates. So it'd be something where they would try to do it, the UAE would say no, it would end up being a proxy war between these two. We would definitively throw in on the side of whoever lets us go through freely, and that would bring us into conflict with Iran. So it's also something where even the threat of doing that has the chance to really mess up global markets. Because if I am an investor and I'm trying to decide, should I invest money in oil companies that are drilling around here, or should I invest my money someplace else? And I think there's a chance, even a 10% chance, that Iran might shut this down for a week. I'm going to pull my money out of here in a second, because that's going to utterly destroy the stock value of any of those companies in the short term, because it makes it uncertain that they can actually get their product out. So the threat of doing it, even if they're unlikely to carry through, has the potential for significant economic destruction and devaluation. Worth knowing about.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Back to that map.
Yeah.
The thing that strikes me
Yeah.
is that it looks to me like there's a need for a canal there.
Well, we got the Suez,
No, I'm talking
but
about
over here,
down the Strait of
Hormuz. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the UAE would be pretty happy about that. It would, yeah.
Has that ever been considered?
It's a great question. I honestly don't know.
Taking land out of it?
That's actually a really good question. I think the biggest issue is that it would take an awful long time to develop. Like, it's probably going to take a decade or so to fully make. But yeah, I think if tensions escalate with Iran, that may be a way to push. Interesting point. I had not thought about that, but good thought.
I was selling shares tonight. I didn't know if anybody wanted to sign up.
Yeah. No, I'm sure some people have contemplated it. I haven't heard much about it, but yeah, it's a really interesting idea.
I think if you're going to go to war over something that's only several miles away, the canal's not going to stand in their way. Very vulnerable.
Yeah, though the issue I suppose would be that you'd be able, well, and the other thing is, unless you're building a super large, like Suez style or even Panama style canal, you're not going to be able to move ships through anywhere near as quickly, so it would at least be a slower route. No one would take that route when they could take the Strait of Hormuz, so it would only be economically worth it to do if the strait was actually closed.
It just takes
But yeah,
the strategic value of the Strait
It does.
of Hormuz
It does.
out of the equation.
Or at least it reduces it, because
Right.
it means that there'd be less of an economic penalty. But yeah, it's an interesting call. It's a very forward-thinking move that would require a significant amount of economic investment now that would not pay off unless everything went to hell. And I think most people are gambling that if it goes to hell in that region, they're not going to be okay anyway, so it won't matter. But yeah, fair call. Last place to talk about is Yemen. Now, there are a lot of other places in the region, but we're going to try to narrow as much as we can. Yemen is, sorry, I'm going to jump back for a second. Boop. Yemen is right down here. And Yemen is basically involved, well, there's a proxy war going on in Yemen as well, much like in Syria. In the Middle East in general, two hegemonic powers are Iran and Saudi Arabia. Those are the two powers that are both trying to define themselves as the ones that are most important in that area. And interestingly enough, one of the main reasons that Iran is in that position is because of the US invasion of Iraq. Prior to that, Iraq had largely kept Iran in check because they didn't like each other very much, so neither of them had a lot of power because they were both pushing against each other. Now that Iraq is changed to where it aligns with Iran much more strongly, sorry, to rewind, Iraq had been ruled by Saddam Hussein, right? Saddam Hussein is a Sunni, one of the two identities in Islam. The majority of Iraq is actually Shiite, which is the other section of Islam. Saddam Hussein was ruling over a country where most of the people were of a different identity than him. That actually happens in a lot of places in the Middle East because colonialism was dumb. But that's the way that it had been. And Iran is Shiite. So the Sunni ruled Iraq, and the Shiite Iran kept each other in check. They went to war a bunch. It was a thing. Once Hussein was overthrown, the government that emerged in Iraq and that we have now is primarily Shiite, which makes them a natural ally of Iran, because Iran is really the only other Shiite power in the region except for kind of Syria. So that means that a country that had been a check on Iran is now a functional ally of Iran, and that has enabled them to bulk up their profile enough to challenge the biggest power in the region, which is Saudi Arabia. Did I just blow through a bunch of stuff too quick, or are y'all with me? Cool. So the reason Yemen is important is because the government of Yemen is Sunni. Most nations in the area, almost all of the Gulf Emirates, are a variant of Sunni. Like I said, Syria up here, it's the leadership of Syria is Alawite, which is a subset of Sunni. Think of the Alawites, a subset of Shiite rather. The Shiites see the Alawites the way that most Christians see the Mormons. In that if you ask the Mormons, they will say, we're totally Christian. If you ask most Christians, they'll say, yeah, but they're a little weird about it. It's the similar sort of thing when it comes to Shiites and Alawites. So most Shiites don't see the Alawites as exactly like them, but for Iran, it's close enough. And they're definitively not Sunni, so that's good enough for them. So back to Yemen. I've jumped around a little. I'm sorry about that. Back to Yemen. The government of Yemen is Sunni. So the government aligned with Saudi Arabia, which is the Sunni power in the world. There's a group that's been trying to fight back against that government, which is pretty repressive. The government is repressive, that is. That group, if you hear about the Houthis at any point, they are a group of Shiite rebels in Yemen who are trying to either kick the government out of power or force the government to make some concessions. It's a little unclear exactly what they want because they're a little fragmented, but at the very least, they want their areas to be left alone by the government. So Saudi Arabia has come in to support the government, and Iran, covertly, has been supporting the Houthis. The main reason both powers care about it is it's a way to show who's stronger, just like the US and the USSR during the Cold War, right? We go into Vietnam not because we super care about Vietnam, but because we need to show up the Soviets. Same kind of thing. So what's been happening in Yemen, first, another proxy war like I mentioned, US has been involved in two major ways. We have provided huge arms sales to the Saudis. We've been doing this for decades, but we just approved another huge package. One of the problems with the war, like civil wars are always icky and there are always a lot of issues with them. This one is particularly bad because Saudi Arabia has been highly indiscriminate in its bombings. Civilian death tolls are incredibly high, even by the standards of civil wars. And to the point where the US has been like you're our buddy, but toward the end of Obama's term, he actually put a bunch of weapons sales to Saudi Arabia on hold and said, look, you just bombed a hospital full of kids. We're not giving you more bombs until you stop doing that. That was on hold. Then Trump came into office. He has reapproved the arms sale and added a new one. So now we've given them more weapons, and they're likely to continue to expand. So their technology and their weapon power is significantly better than their opponents, and they've been using it in a fairly broad way. The other way the US has been involved militarily is there have been some US special ops troops that have been on the ground there. This is something we have not acknowledged as being the case until fairly recently. A lot of what SPECCOM, or SOUTHCOM, which we'll talk about later on, the special forces, a lot of what they do is not officially acknowledged worldwide. But we've had some troops on the ground there largely to find where caches of Houthi weapons are and relay that information back to the Saudis so that they can hit them and blow them up. At least that's what we've admitted to so far. We don't know what else is happening exactly. But the upshot is Yemen and Syria are both particularly brutal civil wars. In Yemen, we have a fairly active, though one or two step removed presence. And it's definitely something that we can change the dynamics on if we want. Saudi Arabia needs us as much or more than we need them in a lot of different ways, but we've decided it's just not worth it to put pressure on them to stop that. So that's where we are on CENTCOM. Let's go to EUCOM next. Like I said, lots of stuff today. EUCOM, Europe. You may have noticed that there are tons of troops in Germany. We'll talk about that in just a sec. But one thing that's important to know is the head of EUCOM, actually it should be EUCOM, not Eurocom, I mistyped that. The head of EUCOM is also the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. So whoever's in charge of that, I actually don't remember the name of the general right now, but whoever's in charge of that also runs NATO's military operations officially. So it ends up being very important even if they aren't actively involved in combat at other times. Their areas of responsibility are kind of interesting in terms of what they include. They do include Turkey, even though Turkey is close to CENTCOM's thing, it's technically part of Europe, so it's part of EUCOM. Their area of responsibility also includes Israel, which is sort of weird, because it doesn't include any of the other countries that border it. It's just sort of a holdover. We used to have a lot fewer commands. We have expanded them, and as we've created more, and so when we do that, we take some territories from some places and put them into whatever the new place is. EUCOM was around before CENTCOM. CENTCOM before EUCOM. So they grabbed some stuff and not others. The other area that they're in charge of is everything dealing with Russia. So anything in Eastern Europe, all that stuff, that's these folks. Germany hosts about 35,000 US troops. It's actually Germany and Japan, two allied nations, are the places where we have more troops than anywhere else, except, well, the Korean border is right up there too. And any guesses as to why? This is actually something President Trump, when he came into office, was really curious about this. Like, why do we have all these troops in Germany? There's not a war there. And the explanation that was given, that I think is a fairly comprehensive one, is that think about geography, right? If we want to deploy troops into the Middle East, we need to have them already sitting someplace to do that, because transporting troops from the US over there takes days or weeks in most cases. So we need them someplace where they can then move and go. Germany is that place. So Germany is basically our force projection point for most of Europe and most of the Middle East. If they need more troops from someplace, they pull them from Germany, and or the setup that Germany has, all the barracks, all the administrative buildings, all the landing strips, all that stuff, they have all set up so that we can bounce troops through there straight over to the Middle East. The other thing that they do is if we need to deploy troops anywhere to Eastern Europe, Germany is where they deploy from. And then they transfer from one command. Well, there they'd stay part of EUCOM, but if they went into the Middle East, they'd probably transfer to being under the control of CENTCOM. But Germany, the reason it's so important and the reason we have so many troops there is it's the easiest place to deploy to a number of really important regions of the world. And we also built all the infrastructure back during the Cold War, so we don't have to build a bunch of new buildings and new hospitals and new equipment and all that. It's already still there. It also makes Germany a lot happier with us in a lot of ways because it's good for their economy, and that's also where NATO is headquartered. So it means that if us pulling those troops out of there, perceptually at least, leaves NATO headquarters vulnerable. And part of this is just an instance of military presence being used as a diplomatic tool. When we offer to station troops in a country, assuming the country wants us there, if they don't, it's a different deal. But if a country, well, that's called an invasion. But if we offer to put our troops into an allied country, part of what we're doing is we're saying, we guarantee your security. Because anybody who tries to bomb you might hit our people. And if they hit our people, they're in for a world of hurt. So the very presence of US troops there, especially a decent sized number of them, makes it less likely that country could ever be attacked by someone else because they don't want to provoke the US. And while the US technically is obligated to defend any NATO country that's attacked, it's easier for us to wiggle out of that if none of our people got killed in the attack. It's a lot harder if they did. So that's a large part of the rationale as well. Like I mentioned, key staging ground and allows rapid response to Russian action. So that's a lot of what's going on there. Question? All right. That's EUCOM. Oh, yeah, NATO HQ. It's a thing. It's there.
Actually, that's in process.
You're right. But yeah, but I mean under EUCOM, sorry. Not Germany specific, but yeah, that's the wrong place. Yeah.
I had a question. I thought when de Gaulle was president of France, he told all the Americans to go out.
Yeah. Saying we should and having us actually do it are very different things oftentimes. So, yeah. Let me jump to PATCOM. We're going to go to the details here in just a sec, but I just want to give you reference points for a few different places. Major capitals, so you've got Hanoi in Vietnam, you've got Beijing in China, East China Sea is here, Japan is up here. These islands, the parcels and the Spratlys, super important, which we'll talk about in some detail. Okinawa is also down in this area, and that's actually the other major place where the US has a lot of troops based. So, general geography, let's talk details. First off, Indo-PACCOM, just renamed from PACCOM, yay, new things. Single largest area of responsibility, the area that it covers contains more than half the world's population, because it contains India and China, which is more than half the world's population, with the other areas in there. Also, the Pacific Ocean is freaking big. It's also responsible for Hawaii as well, so it has US territory under its control too. There are a few big flashpoints I'm just going to identify briefly, and then depending on what people are interested in at the end, we can go into these in more detail. First is Okinawa. This is where the US stations most of the troops that we have in Japan, in fact, almost all of them. And there are a couple reasons for that. First, Okinawa is not on the Japanese mainland, it's a ways south of that, so it makes for, actually here, I'm going to jump back to the map. It makes for easier deployment to any of these areas down here or to the Koreas. So staging out of Okinawa instead of Japan is useful for that reason. There's another big reason why most of our troops are in Okinawa. And that's because Okinawa has the least political power of any province in Japan. And no one in Japan wants a ton of US troops there polluting the area and creating a bunch of noise and havoc. So they all got put in Okinawa. There have been a number of issues in the last few decades where troops there have done some less than ideal things, and the Japanese have called for us to leave. The US has officially agreed that we will, but never really said when we'll do that, and so we've never actually done it. The other problem is nobody else no other area in Japan wants us to set up huge military bases there. Because remember, they're really crunched for land too. Like land is super valuable there, unlike the US where we have Nebraska, right? Plenty of land, and other states that are pancake-like, like Iowa and stuff, where there's nothing but space. Japan, not so much. So in particular, finding another place to move that base to is difficult, both because they don't want it someplace else and because the people in any given place. It's the not in my backyard phenomenon, right? We all agree this should happen, but not right here. Like we all agree there should be more prisons, but not in my backyard. We all want a nuclear power plant, but not in my backyard. Same kind of thing. So Japan, incredibly important place for us to base troops out of. It provides a lot of benefits to the US strategically in terms of our ability to access different parts of the world, both the South and the East China Sea, but has created a lot of controversy there, worth going into. Second, the South China Sea. Remember those two islands we just looked at? We're going to go back to the slide here. So you've got the parcels, you've got the Spratlys, got a few others as well. You've also got the Daikyu Islands, which is a set of islands. That's another name for one of the groups in here. And you have some artificial islands that China is in the process of building up and creating. I'm going to segue briefly into maritime law. Bear with me. I'm sorry. Here's the basic idea. There are a bunch of things in maritime law that exist and are complicated. But one thing that pretty much everybody agrees on is if you've got territory, 8 nautical miles around that territory are your sovereign waters. Nobody else gets to come there without your permission. In particular, there's something called innocent passage, where if a ship's just going by and it isn't doing anything, like it's a merchant ship or something, that's fine. But military vessels from other countries cannot come into that territory without your permission. Outside of that, you have a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. That's an area of territory where only your country can do things like fishing, mining, anything else along those lines. So getting a chunk of land, like even if it's a really tiny chunk of land, gives you a huge radius around it that you then get to control. With me so far? That's why these tiny islands matter. Because if China, for example, claims the Spratlys as theirs instead of the Philippines claiming them or the US claiming them or Vietnam claiming them, if they get those islands, they also get 200 miles around those islands where they are the only people who can fish or mine or drill. A lot of what we're running into now, and this is also the artificial island thing, where China has brought in dirt, basically, and dumped it on areas that are not quite above the water to make islands that are now above the water, and they say, haha, islands, they're ours! So is all this. That's kind of the strategy now. There are two things that are important. In order for you to claim like the economic zone and whatnot, the rocks or the islands have to be above the water at high tide. So you can't be like, oh, reef showed up over water, territory! You have to actually, it needs to be above the water, and it needs to be big enough that it can host economic activity, which means a random rock doesn't do it. It has to be a rock where a fisherman or a fisherwoman can build a house and cast a line. If they can do that, you're good. Usually it ends up being a bit more than that, but that's the basic idea. And that's why China has built fairly large ones there. They've also built fairly significant defense infrastructure there, from landing strips to anti-aircraft guns, which are designed, if necessary, to defend that territory. The question, and the real big question in this area, is whether that's okay or not, whether you can do that under international law. And nobody really knows. The US has actually not signed on to the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea. We're one of the only countries in the world that has not. So we technically don't have to obey maritime law. But we also can't sue people for breaking maritime law either, because we're not part of it. Everyone basically agrees to the same set of stuff, but the legal force isn't behind it. In these areas, a lot of what's like, I think this is probably one of the 3 or 4 places where conflict or major wars are most likely to break out in the world in the next 10 to 15 years or sooner. A lot of what's been going on with some of the artificial islands is China has been deliberately sailing their boats or ships past those islands. They've done the same thing for these islands that we claim, and the Spratlys, the Parcels. They've been moving ships through waters that we say are ours because we claim them, or Japan or an allied nation claims them. And they're saying, nope, they're not, they're ours. And to prove it, we're gonna sail a destroyer straight through the middle of them. Hello, 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 goodbye. Kind of daring us to do something about it. Because if we go long enough without doing anything about it, it kind of becomes established custom, and again, international law on the oceans, super sketchy, and it makes it easier for them to make a claim to it. Same thing is happening on the US end around China, the artificial islands China has built up, where we will sail destroyers past there, where China's like, no, this is a legitimate island, 8 miles around here, you can't go there. And the US is like, nah, it's not legit, we're gonna swing by 4 miles off the coast and wave at you. These are the kinds of things that have the potential to quickly escalate. We've also had a number of basically games of chicken where ships will come at each other and then break off at the last minute. Again, these are the kinds of things that create miscalculations that potentially lead to war. So, area worth thinking about. That's Okinawa, that's the South China Sea. Well, let's talk about the Korean border. I'm not going to go too in depth here because again, this is a whole 6.5 another lectures on it. Short version is this is one of the largest concentrations of US troops in the world. And the main reason they're there, well, a bunch of reasons they're there, but one of them is this way, much like anytime we have US troops on the ground, if there's an attack and US troops die, we are definitely going to rain hell down on whoever did it. So having them there is extra insurance to ensure Kim Jong-un that, yeah, if you do something here, there's going to be problems. In addition to that, actually, the Korean border is the single most heavily mined location on the face of the planet in terms of landmines. And it is the main reason the US has not signed on to the International Convention to ban the use of landmines. We're one of the only countries in the world that hasn't, because if we did, we'd have to demine that area, and we're not really keen on that, because then a huge army marches across potentially, and that could be a problem. One of the other issues with North Korea and the Korean border is something called THAAD, which is Missile Defense, Theater High Altitude Area Defense. We'll talk about that when we get to Stratcom in a little bit. But at this point, in a lot of ways, the biggest threat to South Korea isn't actually a nuclear weapon directly, it's the conventional artillery that North Korea has. North Korea has enough, when I say conventional artillery, I mean like howitzers, giant things that lob shells that go boom. They have tons of those built into mountainsides so that we really can't get to them with a preemptive strike. And they have more than enough to level the entire city of Seoul if they want. And that is almost certainly what would happen in the opening stages of any renewed conflict with North Korea on a military level. So the nuclear weapon, there's a whole different, I would argue, political calculus going on there, and that I think North Korea, generally speaking, doesn't actually have any intention of using its nuclear weapons. What it wants to be able to do, and there's a lot of debate on this, so by all means, don't take my word for it. Read and find out what you think. But I think there's a strong argument that says Kim Jong-un's goal is to say, I can hit the US. If you ever mess with us or try to overthrow my government or try to assassinate me or invade my territorial waters, I will destroy Los Angeles. I'm going to lose, but you're going to lose people that you're not willing to lose. You're not willing to take, like, is messing with me worth 1 million casualties on the US mainland? And if the answer is no, then he's safe from the US trying to overthrow him overtly. And I think that is probably his likely goal. That assumes he's a rational actor, which he most likely is. But again, there are a lot of unknowns there. But in terms of South Korea, the biggest threat is generally the conventional artillery on the north end, on the North Korean end. Let's talk Africa. We're going to have to get through this kind of quickly again because of time. Africa's a place. It's big. It's got lots of stuff. You may notice a lot of the borders are straight lines. That's always a giveaway. You'll notice this in the Middle East too. Anyone have a guess as to what straight line borders tells you? Colonialism. This means some people, generally with pale faces, showed up and said, this is ours. Oh, and we want that too. Oh, you can have that, but we're dividing it right here. And it means that the divisions were not done based on natural geographic patterns. And this is super important because when different cultures and groups of people coalesce, they tend to coalesce around geographical features, right? You're on that side of the river, my people are on this side of the river, sort of thing. And so these artificial boundaries, in many cases, put different groups that didn't know, or in some cases very much didn't like one another, into the same country, and then put one of those groups in power under colonialism such that the other ended up being oppressed. If you study Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide in any depth, there is an amazingly powerful argument that that was 95% due to colonialism and how folks set things up there. So Africa, one of the major reasons it has so many problems, one of the reasons there are a lot of issues of corruption, is that most of the governments that are put into place there were not governments that were naturally selected by a group of people trying to figure out who would lead them. They were instead initially selected by whatever country colonized them and whatever group they happened to patronize. And then when that country left, they said, okay, do democracy. And so the people who had all the money and all the wealth and all the weapons and all the power, because they had been the ones the colonial folks had supported initially, were like, all right, we'll do democracy. If you come to the polls, we'll shoot you. Election tomorrow. And that's how it went. So a lot of the issues in Africa they're incredibly complicated, but colonialism is at the root of the vast majority of those issues and the way that things were set up. There are a few places in particular that I want to focus on. One is the DRC. This is pretty close to a world war, at least a continent-wide war that no one really pays attention to. Democratic Republic of Congo used to be Zaire, but the DRC has been engaged in ongoing civil war for decades, and no one really cares because it's Africa, so it doesn't bother us, and we're kind of racist that way sometimes. A lot of the reason that happened is if you look to neighboring areas, you've got South Sudan and Sudan, which we'll also talk about a little if we have time. Anyone find Rwanda for me up there? Should be in the Greater Horns. You got Tanzania. Did they not label it? What's that? Should be, yeah. Anyway, so Rwanda so the Rwandan genocide, the short version is you've got two major ethnic groups, the Hutu and the Tutsi. The Hutu are the majority. They're about 70% or so of the country. Well, it depends on whether you're talking totals before or after, but they're a huge chunk of the country. They are generally poor. They are not the portion that was in power while the colonial powers were there. The Tutsi were the ones, they're the minority. They were the ones who were in power because the colonizers thought their skin was slightly lighter and therefore they were more trustworthy. I wish that was an exaggeration or a caricature. It's not. They were the ones who were largely in power. And so eventually, this is back in the 90s, a moderate Hutu got elected as president. His plane went down. We don't know if it was shot down. We think it probably was, but it crashed, and that is what tripped off everything. The Hutu had been, a lot of frustration had been rising up for years because the Tutsi had remained in power by and large after the colonizers left and continued to be more wealthy, and the cities in the area were built in places where Tutsi lived, so they got a lot of the benefits economically of living there, etc. And the Hutu eventually rose up and slaughtered 800,000 of them. It's the fastest genocide in the history of the planet. And part of what makes it really complicated is the genocide spilled over from there to Burundi and to a number of other nations nearby. What's happening right now in the Congo, to an extent, is a result of that spillover because those ethnic groups are not constrained to a single country. Remember, lines are artificial. They spanned several different countries and parts of them got lumped in together here. So when the genocide mostly ended in Rwanda, it basically just migrated to Burundi and then to the DRC and other countries in the region. That's one of the big things that's fueling most of the conflict. The second big thing is a substance called coltan. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. It's one you don't hear about, but is in, anybody got a cell phone? I would assume most of you, yeah? You have coltan on you. Pretty much every high-end electronic device needs a degree of this material, and it's actually pretty hard to find. One of the biggest places to mine it is the DRC. So fights over who controls that territory is huge. Diamonds as well. This is, if you've ever heard the phrase blood diamonds, it's usually referring to diamonds that are taken from the DRC or similar areas. The natural resources available there are fairly significant. They're hard to get to, which is part of why there's still a lot of them left, because the easier places to get to we mine out pretty quickly. But a lot of the fighting that's going on there now is about controlling those resources and being able to use them. Let's go from there to how the US military is involved. So generally, there's a very limited combat role for the US military in Africa directly, a lot more indirect support. There's a big focus on providing technical and training assistance to local governments. Kind of like the School of the Americas, but it has a less sketchy history, at least recently. So this is where we will train governments in better ways to discipline troops, to make sure troops do what they're supposed to do and not other things, to fight insurgent groups and do guerrilla warfare more effectively, etc. We're also working to combat extremist groups. The two big ones are Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. Boko Haram is largely based out of Nigeria, Al-Shabaab, Sudan, though they both spread a little bit beyond that. And they're both Islamic in origin, and they're both pretty radical and pretty violent. So the US provides a lot of logistical support to trying to track down those groups. Even though we don't often engage in any direct combat with them, we can help use satellites and other military tech to figure out where we think those groups might be and then give that information to the government of that country so they can go after them. So that's the kind of role that we tend to play in Africa. Potential flashpoints, already mentioned the DRC, Libya, a whole other thing we'd get into if we had a lot more time, which we don't, and South Sudan, the newest country on the planet. It's only been around less than 10 years or so now. South Sudan split in two. Anybody hear ever about Darfur, the genocide there? That was in Sudan before the split. Since South Sudan became its own country, it's doing better than it was when there was an ongoing genocide there, but they still have a lot of problems. Borders in Africa tend to be pretty porous in that it's pretty easy to get from one country to the next in most instances, and so it's easy for conflicts to migrate across from one border to another compared to some other places. So that's AFRICOM. I wish we had more time, but we're gonna have to move. Stratcom. This is the first of our commands that is not based entirely on geography, but is largely based on purpose and objectives. These are the folks with the nukes. Well, the Air Force has control over some of them, but Stratcom is largely the place where most of the control goes through. What Stratcom does is basically two things. They provide strategic deterrence. If we talk about nuclear weapons, we're usually talking about strategic nuclear weapons, two types. Strategic nuclear weapons are the things that you use and you destroy cities with. Tactical nuclear weapons, there are not a lot of out there, but they are much lower yield. They're the things that you would use to destroy a really deeply buried bunker. But if you did that, then you'd cause all kinds of other problems because then someone would be like, oh, you can use a tiny nuclear weapon? I've got one that's tiny too, so I'm going to use that one. And that tiny one is a little bigger, and then the next tiny one is a little bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we all kill ourselves. So tactical nuclear weapons are not where we're going here. Strategic nuclear weapons are what this is about. So Stratcom works to make sure that other countries know if they ever try to hit us, we will wipe them off the face of the planet. So all the missile silos in various places in the US, these folks are the ones who keep an eye on that. Same with being able to deploy bombers or submarines or task orders to those groups. So they both work to deter, but they also work to monitor any incoming threats. So various radar stations that we have set up, things that try to detect missile launches, these folks work with too. The big thing is that they operate THAAD, which is the Theater High Altitude Area Defense System. If you heard about Reagan's Star Wars, this is kind of the modern version of that, because that one never actually worked. This one sort of works-ish. The basic idea behind THAAD, or any ballistic missile defense system like this, is country A launches a missile. Country B, which in this case is us, launches another missile to hit that missile in the air and blow it up before it can ever hit its target. Two things that are relevant there. If it's a nuclear weapon, generally speaking, the nuclear weapon will not detonate under those conditions, right? To trigger an actual nuclear detonation requires a precise set of things to happen. If you shoot a nuke with a bullet, it's not going to go off, mostly. We're pretty sure, because no one really wants to do that experiment. But generally speaking, it's not going to result in a nuclear explosion. It will just result in the missile getting shot down and landing in the ocean or wherever. That's the idea. What you're trying to do is basically hit a bullet with a bullet, except bullets are a lot slower than the things you're dealing with. Nuclear weapons, ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, go at many times the speed of sound, a lot faster than a gunshot does, and actually there are a number of different things that can circumvent this system which are being developed. Hypersonic missiles are one of them, things that will go 20 times the speed of sound, which are just too fast for us to do. Because missile defense in this way has two big components. First, you gotta know where your target is and how fast it's going. Then you've got to get a missile to those exact coordinates at that exact fraction of a second before it goes someplace else. So you need really awesome radar, and then you also need really super accurate, what we call kill vehicles, but missiles that can then hit your target. You with me on that? What that means is that the radar-based systems are really expensive and also things that we can't have in lots of places. THAAD uses a really narrow cone. So instead of the radar being 360, they have to focus into a fairly narrow area. We don't know exactly how many degrees because that's classified, but it's a narrow cone. We have THAAD installed in South Korea right now. Not actually to protect Seoul, because that's important, but the military base in the south of the peninsula where all of our troops are that aren't in Seoul is more important to us. So we have THAAD set up there to potentially shoot down a North Korean missile that might come through. That's also controlled by these folks. THAAD has a spotty track record in terms of testing. We've found that under ideal conditions, where it's clear sky, no clouds or anything, where we know where the missile is going to be, because it's our target, because it's pre-programmed, and there are nothing else messes with it, we can hit our target about 50% of the time. At least that's what the people who make the system tell us it can do. Not that they would have any interest in saying that their system is good. They actually technically say it's got 100% accuracy rate under their ideal conditions. The biggest problem with that is twofold. First, how well it works is really suspect, because even if we can hit that one missile, and usually actually we don't launch a single one, we launch about 5 different ones hoping that one of them will successfully hit it. Because remember, when you're going that fast, if you're off by a quarter of an inch, 20 miles later, that quarter of an inch that you're off by is miles away from your target. If you are 1/100th of a second late, your target is 2 miles that way. So the physics difficulties here are incredibly huge. So that's the first issue. The second issue is countermeasures, and these are things that we really don't have good answers to. There are a number of ways that a country that's launching a missile can avoid the system. The big one is if we have 50 kill vehicles to shoot, they launch 51 missiles. Well, crap. Math says Los Angeles is now a crater. Or if you don't like LA, pick another city. But the point is, overwhelm is one option, where you simply fire more missiles than there are kill vehicles available. Second option is a false overwhelm, where you launch 150 missiles, 50 of which are nuclear, the other 150 or the other 100 are not, and then you get to play a game of whack-a-mole and we get to hope we get the right one. The more concerning thing is something that the former USSR, that Russia already has available, which are called MIRVs, multiple independent reentry vehicles. It's where you launch an ICBM, goes up outside the Earth's atmosphere. When it comes back, the warhead, the front of the missile splits, and a group of about, depends on the size, 15, 20 different warheads all independently re-enter and target different positions. which you then have to try to intercept all of, which becomes super difficult. The other big problem is if the folks who are building the weapons of mass destruction decide to put, instead of a nuclear weapon on top of their missile, a chemical weapon or a biological weapon, then missile goes up, we shoot it down, and instead of a chunk of nuclear stuff hitting the ground, which is bad but not catastrophic, we spread sarin gas over a 100-mile radius and everybody dies. And there are a bunch of concerns where if countries begin to do that, and there's some evidence China has already started to shift in that direction, those kinds of weapons, chemical weapons, are much easier to steal than nuclear weapons because you don't have to steal a whole freaking bomb. You steal a vial and you've got something that's incredibly deadly. And they're also something that's a lot easier for terrorists to potentially get their hands on. So there are dangers in provoking that. The last issue with THAAD, and then I'll keep moving here, but the last issue is, are y'all familiar with the concept of mutually assured destruction? What's the basic idea? Somebody give me a sum up for it? Yeah.
We hit them with everything we've got, and
Yep.
we still have enough left to hit us.
Exactly.
Nobody left.
Exactly. So imagine this scenario. I need a victim/volunteer. Wow, I'm that scary. All right, wonderful. Thank you, Gene. I'm giving you an invisible gun. Here, catch and keep the safety on. All right, cool. You have your invisible gun. I have invisible gun here. We're both pointing guns at each other. Exactly. Think old Western standoff and you were exactly in the right place. Because I know if you pull the trigger, yeah, you're going to shoot me, but I'll probably twitch and shoot you too. So you're not going to shoot me and I'm not going to shoot you unless I'm also willing to die. With me? Same concept works with nuclear weapons. Because from the time you launch it, it takes a fair amount of time for it to go halfway around the world to hit your target, at least if you're Russia and the US or China and the US trying to hit each other. It's a different deal if it's North Korea hitting South Korea. Set that aside. It takes time for that missile to travel. As soon as we know their missiles are in the air, ours will launch as well. They will all land. We will all die. And because we don't all want to die, at least in theory, no one will ever launch. That's the idea. And that's part of why, hopefully, that's part of why, ideally, the Cold War didn't kill everybody. Because we had nukes, we could have destroyed the world, but we all knew the other side would wipe us out if we did. The big question was always, is someone going to make a mistake and miscalculate and think the other side has launched when they actually haven't, which is, there are about 7 times in US history where that almost happened. One of our stations detected a weather balloon outside of Norway, and we were about 5 minutes away from launching a counterstrike back in the 70s. Another time, a flock of geese went over a detection site that we had in Eastern Europe. We thought it might have been a missile. We were within 10 minutes of launching a response. Because remember, the things we're trying to detect are a long ways away and going super fast, and you don't ever want to miss one, right? If one launches and we don't catch it, we're screwed. So our systems for detecting them tend to be hypersensitive and prone to occasional false positives. So, mutually assured destruction. With me, there are problems with it, but generally speaking, it has kept us all from annihilating each other. In the gun and gun scenario, where Gene and I both have weapons, if I'm standing behind bulletproof glass and can put my weapon out, does mutually assured destruction still exist? No. From Gene's perspective, am I more likely to shoot in this situation than I would be otherwise? Yes, and this is the problem with THAAD. First issue is it very well may not work or can be easily circumvented. But if all of that is incorrect, and if, as the US publicly asserts, the system works 100% of the time always, then if you're one of the countries that's been in a standoff with us, the US just got a pane of bulletproof glass, which makes it a lot more likely we may launch if things ever escalate. And it means that if the US launches, so one of the goals, if nuclear war were ever to happen, everybody loses, just off the top. But ideally, if you, in your initial launch, can take out all of the other side's missiles before they can launch, you're good, right? That assumes you can find all of them, which is part of why we bury a bunch of ours underground, why Russia put theirs on trains that moved around so we couldn't know where they were at different times, why a lot of these things are buried behind mountains and whatnot. There are problems with that, but at least in theory, if you can take out all or at least most of the other side's nukes, then you can get away with it and you'll be fine. In this situation, where the US has THAAD, if we think the US, if we are another country and there's a chance the US might launch, we have to throw everything at it, because if we get it wrong, it's game over. The idea that mutually assured destruction would be eroded makes it more likely that another country would act first. Or if they see us setting up more and more of these THAAD sites places, they might realize once they've got complete defenses there, we're hosed. So it's a use them or lose them. We either use them now or we will never have the chance. And that escalates the likelihood that nuclear war might actually erupt. It's the idea of what we call threat construction or a self-fulfilling prophecy. By attempting to prevent a nuclear war, we are deploying the kinds of things that may actually provoke it. Which, yeah.
Everyone trying to create a THAAD in their countries?
Not quite. No one else has the tech, poured the actually hundreds of billions of dollars into it that we have, because we've been working on this for decades now. Most countries just do not have the technical capacity or the money to do it. There are options for stopping slower missiles, because ICBMs are the fastest, so they are the hardest to track and stop. We have something called the Aegis system, which is on on a number of our destroyers, which can track slower, smaller, shorter range missiles and shoot them down. Israel has something called the Iron Dome, which is designed to shoot down rockets. Saudi Arabia has a similar thing to the Aegis, which can shoot down incoming slower missiles, like Scud missiles. So people have tried the lower end version, but the higher end is just technologically and economically beyond most countries. Yeah.
I would only suggest that every advancement in military technology would have followed that same line of thinking, where it somehow lessens the ability. And in reality, what it did most times is it ended up being used as a political tool in diplomacy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the idea that most military advances may end up more being a way to politically intimidate or force concessions from another side rather than actually being used in conflict. I think you're right, and in most cases historically that has been the way things have worked. The one thing that may be different here is the consequences of a miscalculation are higher than they are in any other instance, right? If my side develops tanks and your side doesn't have them yet, if I sit down to negotiate with you, I can totally get you to agree to a lot of things I want because you don't want my tanks rolling over you. But the world doesn't explode if we do go to war. Arguably with nuclear weapons it does, and that may change the stakes. But that's a fair point. Like, not all weapons are actually built to be used. They are sometimes built to intimidate, to achieve diplomatic concessions. We talked about THAAD having political tensions and other problems. Russia is super pissed at us about this. THAAD, as it's deployed right now, isn't a major threat to Russia, partially because Russia has so many missiles it can overwhelm without a problem. A smaller nuclear state like North Korea, it could potentially be effective against because they have a lot fewer missiles, and in theory, but again, that assumes it works and that has other problems involved. We can go into that more if people want. How are we on time? Okay, I got about 15 minutes in the normal time frame to work with, and then we'll do extended stuff from there. SOUTHCOM, also want to spend a bit of time here. This is special operations, so special forces, Delta Force, Green Berets are here. Navy SEAL Team 6 is part of these folks, so is the 75th Rangers. I know there is an Air Force unit, but I can't remember what they're called offhand. But Special Operations Command, so these are folks who oversee basically non-traditional warfare in places. So not like two sides lining up against each other or planes bombing stuff, like this is the groups that track down terrorists or rebel leaders or individual people that we need to deal with. Rescue hostages, that kind of thing. Primarily a counter-terrorist group, but they do a lot of other things too. They actually deal with piracy to a degree. Pirates are a thing. Fewer peg legs and parrots than you would expect, but they're a thing. Off the coast of Somalia, actually. It's a fairly, I wouldn't say common, but it's not an uncommon thing, where folks will get a boat and machine guns and they will go out and they will stop a trade ship as it's going by, take the people hostage, demand a ransom, or they'll shoot them. And they're kind of hard to deal with because then they just disappear back into Somalia, which has almost no law enforcement in any meaningful way because the country's pretty close to anarchy, and that's that. The US on occasion has sent sniper teams out there to deal with them, which are almost always Navy SEALs, and will shoot these people from a mile away because they're really good at what they do, which is kind of scary. They specialize in unconventional warfare, so they are not the people you will find on front lines. They are not going to be the bastion of any kind of invasion force. They are all about achieving a very specific mission. They tend to operate in about 12-person units. That'll fluctuate a little, but that's sort of the standard deployment unit. They go a place, they do a thing, they get out. There are some international law issues in that a number of the places they go to do things, we are not at war with. Actually, technically, we're not at war with anybody except technically still North Korea. because we signed an armistice, not a peace treaty with them. But either way, we haven't declared war since World War II. And again, North Korea, it's a conflict, I suppose, not technically a war. But those technicalities aside, these troops will be sent into places that are not active battlegrounds, not a country that the US has declared an intention to use military force against. They'll show up in Pakistan, they'll show up in Yemen, other places like that. They give us a lot of flexibility, and when we're dealing with an unconventional opponent, they're actually incredibly important, right? You can't find like terrorism HQ and go to war against it, because it isn't a place, it's people scattered all over the place. You need to find and hunt down those individuals. Generally speaking, SOUTHCOM are the folks who are in charge of making that happen. A lot of their deployments are undeclared, which is one of the other things. These folks, again, operate in kind of that fuzzy area between officially declared actions and more of the stuff the CIA does, which is off the books sort of thing. Where exactly they fall depends on what you're talking about. But that's SOCOM. Transcom gets no attention, but they deserve a few minutes because they do important stuff, so I want to pay attention to them briefly. All logistical deployments generally get coordinated by these folks. So anytime troops need new underwear, more bullets, or anything, Transcom is generally what provides for that. Super important, but not generally a source of big controversy. There aren't really a lot of things that I'm familiar with that are issues for these folks, but I just want people to know they exist, because I would be doing them a disservice if I ignored them. Last group, and the most recent one, is Cybercom. These folks just came into existence less than 10 years ago. They're still very much getting up and running. They do a couple things. They do defensive cyber ops, which includes protecting communications, encrypting information, countering electronic warfare. Here's what I mean by that. So US sends up a drone, right? You all are familiar with drones. Yes, big remote control airplanes, often with large bombs on them. We send one of those up. We're connected to that electronically. In theory, it is possible for someone else to try to connect to it. As of now, that hasn't happened. Well, we had one instance where someone was able to hijack the video feed from it, but they weren't able to like give it commands or anything like that. But these folks are the people who would help prevent that from happening. They design the software, they design the security systems that keep people out of our military systems. Our defense network, anytime there's internal information that's being held by the Defense Department or anyone else involved, Cybercom is what's making sure that stuff is safe. Critical infrastructure. The US relies very heavily on GPS these days because it's tremendously precise and very useful. Getting someone messing with our GPS signal will be a huge problem. These are people who can prevent that, at least ideally. The other part of what they do that we don't know anywhere near as much about are offensive cyber operations. These are things where we will work to disrupt other people's electronic communication or hack other people's information. This includes everything from, This includes everything from hacking into secure emails in an opposing state to find out military secrets, to shutting down power grids that supply power to a naval base or something like that. We don't know all of what they're capable of. There are offensive cyber units in other countries, North Korea in particular. This is one of the major places where they have gone. Like, they know a conventional war, they cannot win against most of the major powers in the world, but they can go here, especially because this stuff is a lot harder to track. It's a lot harder to know who done it, because it came from an anonymous IP address that bounced through 17 countries and got rerouted across 6 different platforms in order to get to you. So it allows for deniable warfare, which is really scary because we don't have a great way to respond. Like, if North Korea, and they have done this several times in different ways, hacks into the Pentagon, right? What do we do? Is that an act of war? I don't know. Is it appropriate to say, we're like 60% sure you did this, so we're gonna bomb you? And so ideally, a cyber attack would be met with a cyber counterattack, and these folks are the ones who are in charge of developing those things, potentially being able to deploy them. So you hack the Pentagon, we shut down your power grid in one of your cities for a while, that kind of thing. The other thing that's important with Cybercom is they are not tasked with protecting civilian infrastructure. They are only focused on protecting defense infrastructure. So that means our power grid, not involved. That is not their thing. Department of Homeland Security, DHS, does that. The FBI has a pretty robust cyber crimes unit, which also includes some of this. The NSA is largely about monitoring different communications, but they also do some work on encryption. The CIA has an area. It's very much a hodgepodge right now, which is part of our problem, but that's sort of a separate issue. So that's Cybercom. Last thing that I wanted to talk about are costs. You've seen all of what we get out of this. Let's talk about what it costs us, and then we can discuss how much of that is worthwhile and how we can deal with it. This, as of 2007, this looks at discretionary outlays. So federal budget has two parts to it. It has mandatory spending, which are things like Social Security, Medicare, payment on the debt, like interest payments on the national debt, things that we don't get the choice of how much we're going to do every year. They are fixed and they are mandated by law that we have to do. Then there's discretionary spending. That's everything else. It's about half the federal, a little less than half the federal budget. And this is where every time Congress passes a new budget, they decide how much they're going to put in what places. So out of discretionary spending, this is basically how stuff breaks down. See defense, just under 50%. Again, this is 2017. This has changed recently. The amount we allocate to defense has gone up since then under Trump. Now I think it was $719 billion in this last year. When this one was done, it was $530 billion. So we have increased the amount we spend on defense and coincidentally cut what we spend on most of these other things. So this is the current outlay relative to other programs. For a broader perspective, this is the outlay relative to different countries in the world. Because it's one thing to know how we do it, it's worth knowing how our potential allies and opponents do it. Again, this is slightly outdated. It's a year old, so 2017. 717, I was off by $2 billion, sorry. Trump changed from a government, not so much for everybody else. So US spending, not $610 billion, but $717 billion now. This is the combined spending of all of these countries. Yeah, pretty much. And there are good reasons potentially for this, and we can talk about that. But for example, our next closest competitor is China, who spends about $200 billion. So we're spending more than 3 times the amount on military that our next closest rival is. We spend more than the next 7 largest countries combined, which includes most of our allies. So it is a significantly large expense for us.
Isn't that actually one of the problems? Because a lot of our allies are not spending enough, and they rely upon the U.S. to provide the protection.
In part. So let's talk real quick about NATO, because that's what this goes into.
NATO, Japan, I mean...
We have treaty obligations with regards to NATO. Japan doesn't have the same kind of obligation because they actually, when we rewrote their constitution after World War II, we said you cannot have a military. We will be your military. You don't get one because the last time you had one, it ended badly for us. So no more of that. So Japan, I think, is a slightly different deal because they have a self-defense force which does some of that, but we have made it very difficult for them to do military buildup based on how we dealt with the conclusion of World War II, which largely worked out okay for us in the end.
Japan pay us for?
They pay, well, yes and no. We get basing rights there, like Okinawa. One of the main reasons we get to do that is that's to further our commitment to provide their security. One of the other things involved is we've convinced Japan to never try to develop a nuclear weapon. They have some cultural reasons to not want to because they're the only ones they've ever been used on, and that's an understandably deterring sort of thing. But we've said, don't develop nukes. If you don't, we will guarantee that we will protect you with nuclear force if anyone ever comes at you that way. So Japan is a little more complicated than I think some of the other ones because of the entanglement. But when it comes to NATO and our European allies, there's an agreement that, and they signed an agreement that I think it was by 2025 or 2030, I'm not positive on the date, that all NATO countries should be spending 2% of their GDP on defense. That's the goal. The US right now spends about 4.7% of our GDP on defense. That may be up in the 2019 budget. I haven't seen that yet, or I haven't crunched those numbers yet. Most other countries in NATO spend about 1.7% of their GDP on defense. It varies a little bit. Some of them are at the 2% threshold, but not a lot. And so there is a push. This is something that President Trump has been very focused on. He frames it in a way that I don't think is entirely accurate in that he says they owe us money, which is not the case. They aren't paying us money. The idea is that those countries should all spend a certain amount on defense so then we don't have to do as much to protect them on their behalf. And there's definitely truth to that. They are doing less than we would like them to do, which requires us to do a bit more, but there's a flip side there too. And that's that when we're the ones with the troops in a particular place, we then get to decide what happens with those troops. The reason we can base all of those troops out of Germany is because we are providing the defense for them there, and that enables us to then redeploy those troops wherever we want without the kind of problems we would have if we tried to deploy NATO troops someplace and had to get approval from the rest of NATO to do it. So I think there's truth to the statement that our allies are not doing as much as they should, and that's requiring us to do more. But on the flip side, there are also benefits that we get from doing it that I think it would be inadvisable to disregard. So next bit from here is this question. I think this is a quote worth looking at. I expect some of you may have heard it, but I enjoy it. It's that every gun that's made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, and those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of laborers, the genius of scientists, and the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It's 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 people. It's 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It's some 50 miles of concrete pavement. We pay for a single fighter with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. Things are different now than they were in the Cold War when Eisenhower made the quote. And I don't know that all of it is entirely applicable. In fact, in most cases, the costs that he's referencing are actually higher now than they were then because the things we produce are much more technologically developed and cost a lot more. The F-35, which is the top generation of fighter, is the most costly military development project in history with a price tag of over $1 trillion. So for the entire product line that the US government has paid to, I think it's mainly Lockheed Martin. So the main reason I wanted to put this here is, I think, in a lot of ways, it's easy for us to set politicians and against generals, and Eisenhower is one of the few who I think has been in a unique position in recent times to have been able to see both sides of things. It also means that there are costs that are worth considering in terms of what we do with our military. It does not mean that they shouldn't be funded. It does not mean that they aren't important, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be a significant part of our spending. But it does mean that we need to set up the costs next to the benefits rather than just thinking in abstract dollars. Think in terms of what we get in both sides and figure out how we're going to weigh and compare those issues. It's worth noting that American infrastructure spending has declined during the Cold War period and never really came back up since World War II era and before. One of the reasons, arguably, is because more of our focus and spending has gone here than other places. There's some powerful arguments that say that is a worthwhile trade, that the safety we've got and the stability economically by being able to police large portions of the world, that those benefits are worth the trade-offs. And I think I respect that argument. I just think it's important to have that discussion and understand that both sides exist. So that gets us to a couple questions about where we can go from here. First is the question of whether we spend too much or too little on foreign aid. Because one of the other major ways we can influence the world, we can send the Marine Corps, we can send the Peace Corps, right? Pardon the parallelism, but the idea is basically the same. We can spend money to place military assets near a place or to train people in their area to try to ensure security, or we can help to develop those countries so that they are more stable in and of themselves. Generally speaking, the poorer a country is, the less stable it is, because, and in particular, the less there's a developed middle class in a country, the less stable that country is. So being able to provide development does a lot in terms of stability potentially. Just as a question for you folks, I just want to divide this into 3 options. If I were to ask about the amount we spend on foreign aid, I'd like to take a quick poll of people who think we spend too little, people who think we spend about the right amount, and people who think we spend too much. You all follow what I'm asking? So if I can ask folks who think we spend too little on foreign aid right now. Okay, so 2, 4, 6, 7. People who think we spend about the right amount on foreign aid right now. Okay, cool. People who think we spend too much on foreign aid right now. All right, that's actually on almost even division. That's really cool. So out of curiosity, how much do you think we spend, what percentage of our budget do you think we spend on foreign aid?
Not very much.
Well, anyone got specific, like percentage-wise? What do you think?
Less than 1%.
You think less than 1%? Okay. What other people think?
When you say foreign aid, are you including military aid?
I am not. I'm including non-military, great question, but I'm including development assistance, money that is given for non-military, non-security purposes, building up civil society, building up economies, building up democracies, that kind of thing.
Talk about giving or loaning or?
Giving, or the net cost of loans.
What China does isn't give.
We'll talk about that in a sec. Yeah, that is admittedly different, but these were supposed to come up one by one, but I screwed the slide up, so bear with me. What do you think?
3%.
You think 3%? Fair. Other people? Give me estimates. Folks on the too little side, were you one of the too little or too much, sir? Too little? Okay. So any other people on the too little side? Other guesses about how much we spend? I heard less than 1%. Yeah, all right. People who think we spend about the right amount. About what percentage of our budget you think we spend on it? Maybe a better way to do this is, what percentage of our budget do you think we should spend on it? Let's just go there. Say that again?
Percentage of what?
Percentage of our total federal budget. So of all the money the federal government spends, of all the money the federal government spends, what percentage of all that money should go to foreign aid? Let me hear you.
5%.
I hear 5%. I hear 4%. I hear 1%. Is that right?
2%.
2? Okay. I've heard so far a high of 4 or 5, a low of about 1. Anyone want to move outside that range? Fraction of a percent. All right, fair.
10%.
10%? All right, yeah, fair. And part of the question that we'll have here is a lot about what we get for that money that we spend. And there's an argument that says that developing other countries and other economies helps our own economy, because those are people who can now afford to buy our stuff. So, or sell us stuff cheaply. So there may be longer term benefits that come from this, whereas launching a bomb generally doesn't make us any money. So that's, well, it makes Lockheed Martin money, which indirectly makes us money, via taxes, I suppose, assuming they pay taxes, which is sketchy. We'll talk about the corporate tax rate another day. But, so I'm hearing somewhere between a fraction of a percent up to about 10%, with most folks averaging around 3 or 4%. Does that seem like a fair read of the room? We'll come back to the China one. Here is the status quo. So Medicare, Medicaid, and all that, about a quarter. Social Security, about a quarter. Veterans benefits, which is not included in military spending, even though arguably it probably should be, because it's a cost of war that we should recognize. About 4. Unemployment, retirement, anything else that is not Social Security, about 10%. National defense, about 17% of the total budget, half of discretionary budget, but 17% of all of it, including the mandatory stuff over here. Other includes interest on the national debt, includes a bunch of other administrative programs that we have to do, running the government type stuff. International stuff, if we don't include, so this is like economic assistance for security assistance, enabling that kind of thing, the State Department to some degree. But international development and humanitarian assistance, this is about 2 years old. The number's actually dropped since then, because we've dropped the amount of money we spend on the State Department in the most recent budget. It's closer to about 0.6% now. That's what we spend. What do you think?
Where was the 20 trillion that we're in debt?
That interest on the debt would be in the other portion of it. So that would be here. In terms of the total debt that exists, that's not about the initial budget, but where that comes in is how much we are paying on interest as that goes up and up and up. So fair to note that other things may have to be curtailed in order to effectively deal with that. But assuming our current spending pattern, this is where we're at. Go for it.
So you're saying that Iraq, for example, you're saying the rebuilding of Iraq after we went there and destroyed it, is not included in our military budget?
Depends what it is that we're doing there. If we're doing, so development assistance and humanitarian assistance are the two that's focused on there. Security assistance is different. So training their army, training the police might fit into this area, but training their army definitely does not. Humanitarian assistance is, there was a disaster, there's a famine here, there was a tsunami, people need help, we get them food and blankets and stuff. That's humanitarian assistance. Development assistance is building up economies, building up roads, building up civil society and infrastructure there, training judges, that kind of thing. What you're talking about, I think, like the rebuilding in Iraq, I think that's largely going to be security assistance, and that's largely in this part here. Does that speak to your question?
Yeah, it's just, I find it difficult to separate a lot of things
That's
because
fair.
war is so much of what we are today that it's like, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Where's the
And
money going?
part of this gets to how the budgeting process works and how we allocate things to different departments with some arcane Senate and House rules about stuff. But yeah, admittedly, there's a bit of crossover and a bit of confusion, but the part that we earmarked specifically for countries that we are not at war with, trying to build up civil society, is there. So the one thing that I'd suggest here before we move to the last bit and I answer general questions that folks have is, if you, based on what you think we should be spending on humanitarian aid compared to other things, I think, and development assistance in particular, I think it's worth considering, like you folks, by and large, based on the polling, are pretty typical of most Americans. Generally speaking, America's actually leans a little bit more in the direction of saying we spend too much on foreign aid. The average amount that Americans think we spend on foreign aid is about 7%. They assume it's about 7% of our budget. And they say that is too much. And I think in most cases, once folks have an idea of what we actually do spend, the target amount that on average people in the US say we should spend on foreign aid is about 5% of our budget. But most Americans also think we are spending too much when we are spending far less than 5%. And I think part of it is we don't see these benefits in anywhere near as concrete a way as we see others. And by no means is the State Department or USAID, they're not perfect. Like, they screw up. They aren't as efficient as they can be. But there's a fairly persuasive argument, I think, that preventing wars by developing countries may be a better security strategy than fighting wars with countries that have collapsed. And one of the things that makes a country less likely to collapse are more people that are invested in the economic process. Think about it this way. And China is actually a good example of this, in India to some degree, but China has become significantly more democratic over the last 30 years, since Deng Xiaoping really shifted the nature of China to being a pseudo-capitalist, but controlled economy, in that people have some say in who runs in local elections. They don't have a lot, but they have some. Compared to what they had under Mao, it's a hell of a lot. They have moved in a much more democratic direction, and one of the big reasons they've done that is the middle class in China has exploded. There's still a lot of people who are incredibly poor, but the number of people who are middle class has expanded significantly. And once you have something to lose, you then become a lot more invested in making sure things don't go to hell. And that's a trend that arguably we can see in a lot of places throughout history. Strong, stable democracies tend to be ones that have a strong middle class that can then exert influence. More unstable countries, I'll get to you in 1 second, sir. More unstable countries tend to be ones that have a very large gap between a small, very powerful and rich elite and a massive, impoverished underclass. And development assistance is one of the big things that helps to shrink that gap and raise more people from the bottom up. Again, it's a more long-term strategy, and it's often less satisfying. I think this is one of the major reasons why a lot of people sort of knee-jerk react against some degree of it is when they are doing things like they don't have things right in their country. We have problems here. Why should we help them instead of here? Which makes a lot of sense. The question that I think is worth asking is whether we're comparing the right two things. The choice may not be between helping folks there and helping people here. It may be between helping folks there and bombing folks there, whether it's today or 10 years from now. And that, I think, becomes a different discussion with a different set of choices and priorities. Let me get to your comment, sir.
Yeah, when you say, what do you have to lose?
Yeah.
I mean, these military companies, they're not going to give up.
Nope.
And they have a lot to lose if we reduce their budgets. So, and they employ a lot of people everywhere.
Yep.
And so, I don't see any
Yep.
hope in.
Well, this is the military-industrial complex argument that Eisenhower himself warned about. There are a few things that I actually find slightly encouraging there. And that's that the arms production portion of our economy is less than 1% now. Significantly less than it was in the Cold War. I was actually not aware of this until I was doing more research to prep for this. I was like, holy crap, seriously? The financial services sector is what has eclipsed that, which is a whole different kind of warfare, arguably. But yeah, in any case, the military-industrial complex has shrunk significantly since the Cold War, which gives me some degree of hope. I think the big thing that needs to change a bit is both information and people knowing what the status quo is before in order to make better decisions about what it should become, and being able to see things side by side in terms of what real costs are. And this kind of, the gentleman left, but to his point about debt and the implications of that is a whole nother topic I would love to do a discussion on, or a lecture on if we have time, because yeah, we got significant problems there in the long term, but even within what we're already allocating, there may be ways to reallocate that would make it better. So we are at and past time. I'm willing to stick around for another 20 minutes if people have the particular areas they wanted to ask about and questions they wanted to get into, but I will not give you the stink eye if you have to take off now. Yeah, I figured a fair enough number of people would. So 1 sec, let me